good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending where you are. My name is Mark Cumming. I'm from Comhlámh in Ireland and also a member of the Forum Board. And I'm delighted to host this learning pod, the Good Practice Pod, on the role of volunteering coalitions at national level. We've two presentations for you, and during the course of them, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share, do pop them into the chat box, and our colleagues will endeavour to reply to them as we go. So our first speaker is Nichole Cirillo. Nichole is the Executive Director of IAVE, the International Association for Volunteer Effort. Nichole has extensive leadership, management, fundraising and communications experience, gained working with teams of staff and volunteers in different parts of the world. Nichole herself has been a volunteer for much of her life, and partnerships building has been a common theme throughout her career. Her experience is drawn from across environmental and social justice sectors. Nichole holds a BA in political science and a master's in urban planning and environmental policy. So Nichole, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to Forum and IVCO for having me here. This is a very important topic, the global leadership for volunteering, and something that IAVE has worked quite significantly on throughout its history. So I'm delighted to be here today to talk about the Global Network for Volunteering Leadership at IAVE. But first, just a bit about my organization. IAVE's mission is to create a more just and sustainable world by enabling the leaders, organizations, and environments that empower volunteers. We do this through advocacy, knowledge development, and also leadership development, which is what I'm going to speak about today. IAVE has worked for more than 25 years with leadership structures in volunteering. We've done these through convenings by bringing them together to share their challenges, their solutions, and to meet one another. We do this by skills development sessions, and we also do it by research, by simply asking them what they need and what's important to them. All of this is available on IAVE's website, these research reports that you see here, which is iave.org. So to talk more about our network for volunteer leadership, first let me say, why is this important? Why is leadership for volunteering important? Well, United Nations Volunteers has been quite strong about the need for what we call leadership volunteering structures. And for us, that means structures that allow for this cross-sectoral cooperation. So volunteering leadership organizations working with government, working with the private sector to really build volunteering in that country or in that region. It really is volunteering that allows for this organizational identity. I understand better what I do because I'm part of this larger collective of volunteering. And this notion of organizational learning, that we learn, but we also share what we learn, that we work together to build the knowledge of the sector. And finally, organizational innovation, that simply by working together, we create these ideas factories and innovate about what the volunteering sector needs, what the successes are that it's achieving, so that we're able to scale those successes. So all of these are what are behind IAVE's Global Network for Volunteer Leadership. We also know that these organizations have challenges. Their governments are often inconsistent in the financial support or their policy support that they provide for volunteering in that country. Sometimes business engagement doesn't exist, and there is a weak philanthropy, meaning that finding resources to help build these structures is often still a challenge. And then also we have this notion of a collective system of volunteer organizations working really closely with volunteer sending organizations to make sure that we're building that vibrant culture within the country. So these are just some of the challenges that these organizations face, and then also why IAVE decided to create this network. We're up to more than 76 members across 64 countries, And really what we're doing here, some of our accomplishments to date have been building this network, really helping them mobilize, helping them to create a stronger advocacy platform, both for themselves and of course for the network as a whole, working to build their financial and their social capital. One of the things IAVE finds is by resourcing them even just a little bit, their capacity really does grow. And also by providing them access to and influence to the networks that we hold internationally really does allow them to bolster their influence back at home. And they tell us that all the time. When we have them as a part of our global stage, they become more stronger, and their legitimacy to act back home in their own countries grows. And finally, that knowledge and development and dissemination, which I'm going to speak about for most of the rest of my presentation. So when COVID-19 hit, IAVE really realized that these national volunteering structures were greatly impacted. And so we commissioned a study to understand really what they were facing, what the challenge of COVID-19 had presented, and how they were succeeding, where they were really struggling, and what this network said, what were we able to say as a whole about volunteering leadership structures during a time of crisis. So one of the things that we learned about was the importance of partnerships and coalitions. And that the survey really looked, in order to meet the demands of the pandemic, that these leadership organizations really needed to build partnerships and coalitions, both within the sector and without. And here we saw almost 71% of them were really strengthening their advocacy through this notion of partnerships. They really strengthened the partnerships with governments and their partnerships with companies. And most importantly, that second part, partnerships with new coalitions with volunteer involving organizations to support their mobilization. And for us, that is a huge finding. That really says that the Global Network for Volunteer Leadership has a significant role to play in facilitating these linkages and enabling these volunteer leadership organizations to understand how to form these effective partnerships in new ways. That's a very important finding for us all as we think about what these leadership networks need. We also knew but really we always knew these organizations were strong advocates for volunteering. But this experience showed us during COVID-19 how very important they are. Many of them reported to us that the pandemic ironically made it easier for them to advocate, that they were really able to show the vital role volunteering plays in the community, and that the pandemic actually created this momentum to showcase the importance of the work, that volunteer leadership organizations became the go-to place for governments, for businesses, and for people to understand what was happening in their community. And really this notion of that the GNVL creates this opportunity for learning and sharing and building this collective advocacy. That is such an important takeaway. And you see it in that bottom quote from from the United Arab Emirates, that says that before the pandemic, all the ministries they work with now know that volunteering is a key partner in all of the challenges that are faced. We really talked about this notion of inclusiveness. I think we all saw that, no matter where we are, that the COVID-19 uncovered inequity and inequalities in healthcare and in services. And for our volunteering leaders, that was no different. They really understood through the COVID-19 experience that the treatment of volunteers is not always equal, and that there are barriers to volunteering that equal issues of exclusion. And so their ability to advocate for inclusiveness became really, really important. And you see in those bottom figures, 70% of these national leadership organizations feel that future volunteering and mobilization programs will have strategies to become more inclusive of a wide variety of participants. Development role of these volunteer leadership organizations became very important and was really highlighted during COVID-19. So their ability to reach down to provide the services and catalytic to the capacity development that enables catalytic volunteering in their country or region. That role really rose to the top. And you saw 95% of them really understanding this notion of the need to develop technology and as a volunteering sector. And that really this notion of working with almost 75% of them, really working to build the capacity of those community-based volunteer organizations. That became really, really essential during the time of the pandemic. And for us, that key finding that leadership development will always be a deep need and a deep focus of these volunteer leadership organizations and of our global network for volunteering. Also, this focus on capacity building of activities during COVID-19, that 95% believe their own leadership capacity to support their work had changed during this. And this is really important when you think about all of the things that were going on in those early days, to be able to recognize and to be able to do what we've called pivot into new directions and new programs. That's a very important skill. And so when you see that figure of 95% of them saying they met that moment and were able to pivot into new areas is extremely significant, because I'm not sure all systems were necessarily able to do that as well as this group did during the pandemic. So that they really understood that their strategic leadership changed because of this pandemic and because of how they were able to deal with it, which is a significant comment about their flexibility and their ability to pivot. Other development priorities became this notion that a quality standard for volunteering is really, really important. You see that reflected in that figure of 76% of them noting that. And this notion of safety and safeguarding, 82% of these organizations said that became a significant priority in their work and in developing these local community organizations' ability to safeguard and practice volunteering safely. Again, back to strategic leadership, which I think we can never say enough. COVID-19 really produced that step change in terms of adaptation in this very, very fast-moving situation. And again, 87% saying that because of the pandemic, they were able to really engage in issues, they were able to engage in issues very quickly. They were able to change what they needed to do to adapt to the circumstances on the ground. 84% were able to revise those priorities and really look at things like online support and digital and virtual volunteering when in-person volunteering was no longer possible. And again, that 73% said because of what they saw in the inequities and inequalities, 73% were going to be more focused on human rights and social justice issues throughout their volunteering. And that notion that the pandemic was absolutely a catalytic opportunity to revisit what had already been there. Those inequities, many of them were already there, but the pandemic really allowed them to confront these ideas and to really look at them and adapt in the moment. The future of volunteering became a very important takeaway from this. And this notion, these 4 items being really important for volunteer leadership structures going forward from the pandemic. So this notion of being prepared for future crises were at the forefront of their minds. They didn't have solutions or answers yet, but merely knowing that they needed to be more prepared the next time was a vital takeaway from the pandemic experience. Also, that COVID-19 is likely to restructure the volunteering leadership. Many people want to get back to in-person volunteering, but virtual volunteering will always be a part of the picture, and they know that now. There are many other changes that really are going into restructuring how we do volunteering in the future. This importance of relationships and networks from local to regional to multinational became apparent during the pandemic to these organizations, and something they felt they needed to continue. And then again, this notion, and it really is just a question, is what about technology and the role of face-to-face volunteering? Certainly the statistic that we saw from this survey is almost half of the organizations could not do face-to-face. And at the same time, there was an incredible need for face-to-face. So the question is not binary. It is not we won't do this or we will do this. It's how do we incorporate technology into what we know is already a very significant need in volunteering. So just finally, implications for us for this global leadership network is again taking those 4 points forward, that this network is extremely significant and that the need for networks is extremely significant to reinforce, to support, and to protect those practicing in this sector. And that 65% said that their being in this network already allowed them to really connect and share and survive in this really important moment. And that 55% said that being a part of this network really provided this specific support to address the challenges they needed. So for us, this really is the affirmation we needed to understand that going through experiences like this in isolation is devastating, and that the importance of a network to celebrate and to uplift volunteering is very important. But it's equally important in terms of weathering storms like this together, and together meeting challenges so that we survive not just intact, but better and more equipped to meet the next challenge. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to answering questions in the chat.
Thank you, Nichole, for that very inspiring and encouraging reflection on leadership over the time of the pandemic. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Romanus Mtung'e, and he will also introduce his colleague Freeman Givonse, who is a health and safety and environmental volunteer with Cuso. Romanus is a training facilitator for development program managers, an experienced health manager with a degree in health management, and a marketeer with a master's degree in marketing. Working with international and national volunteers, he has managed and provided economic empowerment to thousands of small and medium-sized entrepreneurs through business development services, market linkage, access to finance, technology, and business formalization in Tanzania. He's also managed sub-grantees that include NGOs and CBOs and a network of over 2,000 volunteer community change agents under the funding support from the Global Fund and the US President's Malaria Initiative in various regions of Tanzania. He has been the Tanzania country representative for Cuso International for the past 5 years, after having worked as country director for Population Service International for over 10 years. So, Romanus, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and the entire Forum Preparatory Committee. In this presentation today, I would like to share a vivid example of the volunteer coalition through a project called the TLED, or Tanzania Local Enterprise Development Project, which was implemented in Tanzania for 5 years. As I've been introduced, I'll be presenting this with my colleague, who is Freeman Givonse, a long-serving national volunteer who was in the coalition for a long period. Now, before I go on with the approach of this project in terms of coalition, I would like to let you know who Cuso is. So Cuso International is a Canadian-based international development charity we at Cuso are committed at ending the poverty and inequalities in the world. So we do that by working with the local partners around the world to improve economic opportunities for all, enhance women's and girls' empowerment, and advance gender equality. So each year, we mobilize hundreds of skilled professionals. Here, I would like to stress that skilled professionals are the ones that we mobilize, who volunteer their time and provide their knowledge to the beneficiaries in various countries. So while Kyouso is in its 6th year in the world, it is the 58th year here in Tanzania. And we are currently working in 11 countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, including the Canada's north. So now back to the T-led project approach in a collision manner. So I'll be happy to inform you that a 5-year Global Affairs Canada funded T-led project was centered on a tailor-made services based on small and medium enterprise SMEs needs. That included several services, including provision of foundational courses for business development services, also creating awareness and campaigns and information sessions to the SMEs. We were providing one-on-one coaching, advisory, mentorship, and growth services, creating graphic designing for various products of the SMEs who are dealing with the business, also helping them in market linkages so that they expand their businesses. We were there to provide access to finance and technology through the international volunteers and national volunteers so that they expand their productivity, profitability, as well as employability in the country. Provision of environmental sustainability lessons to the SMEs, but ultimately we are there to ensure that compliance with the regulations for SMEs with the high growth potential is being provided or facilitated to the SMEs. Now, when we are setting up this project, we didn't think about the volunteer coalition. So we are only having 3 critical assumptions with the project to be implemented for 5 years. One of the assumptions was that international volunteers support in empowering SMEs through national partners is simple to do. Just get the partners, get the ultimate beneficiaries of the project, and then start providing capacity building. Another assumption was that the business development services training advisory manuals existed with the partners whom we are going to provide the capacity building. But also partners structures and resources, particularly human resources, were assumed to be available to support and work alongside the international volunteers. Now, guess what? When we started the implementation of this project, a very nice project, using international volunteers, we came to learn that there are so many challenges happening. Basically, 6 were the key challenges that we experienced. One was the short nature of their contracts. They stay for 6 months, 8 months, or 1 year. Now, this was creating a disruption of international volunteers' expertise contribution to the beneficiaries in the country. But also we learned that inadequate knowledge of the local context was a big challenge if you let only the international volunteers to provide the capacity building. Language barrier, we use Swahili in the country here in Tanzania, which is not a global language. So with English, it was a big challenge. It was a language barrier working with the beneficiaries here. And then changes of migration policies. With the time, from time to time, we experience that immigration policies are changing, and while the volunteers have got a short time to stay, and then you spend a lot of time chasing for the permits for their work permit as well as their residence permit. It takes time. By the time you get them, they are almost having a shortest time to stay, and they are facing a number of other challenges. Partner staff numbers, limited number of partner staff, but also the capacity gaps in delivering business development services within the smaller number that the partners were having was also another challenge. But also the lack of standardized business development services training and advisory tools or materials was another challenge. So facing that, and the project is 5 years, that's when we came with the idea, oh, let's have now a recruitment of national volunteers, create a coalition, and from the coalition, we can achieve something. Now I would like to introduce Mr. Freeman, a long-serving national volunteer who was the vivid person working with the international volunteers in a coalition manner to tell us what the coalition did and what were the outcomes out of the day. Mr. Freeman, can you come in, please?
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Mr. Romanus and the IVCO Preparatory Board. Well, getting right back at it, I would like to explain what my fellow colleagues said, and we're going to talk about now the International and National Volunteers Coalition. So, due to the challenge that Mr. Romano said earlier, now there came the Volunteer Coalition, on which the coalition, over the 5 years of implementation of the project, the approach evolved from TILED 1.0 for the year 1 to TILED 2.0 for the year 2. Now, following a redesign process, national volunteers were then recruited, because at first they were just international volunteers. So now the national volunteers were recruited and they were supposed to work alongside the international volunteers. So what did this mean? It means that one international volunteer to one national volunteer, they were paired. So these together, these two groups, various groups from various departments, work together as counterparts. And the international volunteers, advisors, focused on advisory, coaching, and mentorship activities, while the national volunteers, they supported the facilitation and organization for the delivery of services by the international volunteers, as well as delivery of fundamental and advanced courses to SMEs. Now, other thing is that national volunteers also supported national partners to deliver business development services and the foundational courses. So you might see that working with partners, there are some vital services of which the partner depends directly on the national volunteers, like provision of this business development services, like advisory, trainings, and other things. So these were when these national volunteers came in. Also, this approach defined clear roles and responsibility of partner organization, national and international volunteer. Through this coalition, there was each partner from the partner, international volunteers, and everyone, each one had clear roles, understanding what exactly they were supposed to do. So this enabled a clear delivery of services to the SMEs. And also it presented a hierarchical entry of graduation approach and introduced a curriculum tailored approach that defined the graduation period per service order offered by the volunteer. Also, additional services, including addressing the social cultural barriers. Now you might ask yourself, after this coalition, what happened? Well, quickly is that the success. Now we're talking about the success of this coalition. Almost 1,800 enterprises, more than 1,800 enterprises, which was 106% of the target, were enrolled and received full range of business development services. So you might see through this coalition, we exceeded the target. So 106% of the target enterprises were enrolled and received the services. Also, more than 2,700 new jobs were created, which is 86% of the target, which meant increasing incomes for almost more than 880 businesses, which was a 68% of the target. So you might see through this coalition, services were provided, the impact was already seen, or for almost 2,700 new jobs, which was 86% of the target. Again, is that more than 540 businesses accessed new markets. So you might find that a good example is that the international volunteer and the national volunteers both work together. So the international volunteers provided schemes and provided processes of which will enable an SME to almost think to access international markets, while the national volunteers enabled the provision to acquire the national regulatory things, which enabled the SME to reach new markets. Other thing is that 91 businesses were awarded new technologies, which meant 56% were female-led enterprises. again, is that more than 260 enterprise assessed finance through commercial banks, impact investors, savings and loan schemes through the access to finance component. Lastly, is that more than 1,300 enterprises reported an increase in revenue. And through this number, 52% of these enterprises were women. So that can give you a quick picture of how effective the coalition went. And another thing which I can add is that through this coalition, the national volunteers were able to learn various things from the international volunteers, on which until today they can be applicable and they can be used effectively by the partners here, which enabled a number of enterprise services to be validated and to have clear formal processes on which would ensure the sustainability of their activities. So as you can see a picture here, this is just an incidence of how the coalition meant. You can see some national volunteers and the international volunteers, and you can see all the happy faces because it was such an interesting approach to work to serve these SMEs and the partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Romanus, and thank you, Freeman, and great stories there and great examples of national and international volunteers working together. So thank you, everybody. We hope that you've enjoyed those two inputs. Feel free to put your questions into the chat, and we hope that our colleagues will be able to respond. And yeah, just behoves me now just to thank Nichole again, Romanus, and his colleague Freeman, and thank you for their inputs, and to wish you all well.